Hello, everybody. Thanks for watching this talk. My name is Daniel Keller, and this is a talk on how to do an academic presentation for the Student Scholar Showcase workshop series. I'm a professor in the English department. I've been teaching at universities for about 15 years, and I've given dozens of presentations at international conferences and domestic conferences, some major, some minor. My background, even though I'm in the English department, I don't teach literature. I don't teach writing very much. I don't teach poetry or anything like that. What I do is I'm a linguist. What linguists do is they study language scientifically. So that's my background, is trying to understand from a scientific perspective how language works the way that it does and why it works that way. And today I'd like to talk to you about giving a talk from a very linguistic perspective. And what I mean by that is rather than sort of recapitulate all the thousands of great pieces of advices you'll find online, great pieces of advice that you'll find online, things like, enunciate clearly and speak to the back of the room. I'm going to rather try to take a more linguistic perspective on the question and try to answer, how do you present information in a talk so that your audience can understand it easily? So I have a thesis. I'm going to walk it through piece by piece, but basically it's this. The purpose of an academic presentation, really any academic presentation, is to communicate complex information orally and in a face-to-face environment. Okay. And normally when we do this, when we want to communicate complex information, we actually don't do it orally. Usually we write it down. And that presents a problem because spoken language, the way we talk to one another, is really very different from written language. So the way that we write is quite different from the way that we speak. I think you know that intuitively, but the differences are actually massive. And they have to do with the way that we process language. So the way that our brains take meaning out of spoken language is very different from the way that our brains take meaning out of written language. Maybe the underlying processes are similar, but the form of spoken language is the way that it is to make it easy to understand in a real-time processing face-to-face environment. And so if you want to give a great academic presentation, you need to make your academic presentation more like other spoken face-to-face interactions and less like a written academic text. So have a conversation with your audience. That's my major focus here. I want to convince you that you should try to make your presentation more like a conversation and less like a chapter from a textbook. And to do that, I'm going to give two very specific pieces of advice. First, I want you to tell the story of your research. I want you to present your research as a story, as a narrative. And the second is, as you're doing that, just keep it conversational. Just speak conversationally as much as you're able to. Okay, so let's take each one of these things one at a time. We'll start with the idea that I want you to tell a story of your research. I want you to think about what story is and why it's so important. Because story is everywhere in the way we communicate. We tell stories to each other all the time. We tell stories to ourselves. We communicate in narratives because the idea of a story is just hardwired into our brains, right? The way that we think is in narratives. Because narratives make complex concepts easier to understand. That's what they do. They allow us to take information as it comes in and structure it in a way in our evolving understanding that makes sense. And it's so wired into our brain that narratives have kind of a universal schematic structure. You can look at stories in many languages all over the globe, and they have very similar structures because that structure is actually hardwired into our brains. And happily for us, that universal schematic structure works very well with academic presentations. So I want to demonstrate this. I want to demonstrate that you know how story structure works already a little bit. So here's 6 sentences. They make a story when you put them together, but they're all scrambled up. So I just want you to take a second, pause the video, and try to put these sentences into the order that makes sense, best makes sense for you. Okay, so pause the video now, put those into order, and I'll start again in a second. Okay, all right, so you probably put them into an order something like this. You'll never guess who I saw today. I was in line at Spencer's in the Commons. I heard this voice behind me, and I thought, that's familiar. And it was John Breen. I was like, aren't you supposed to be studying abroad? I guess John lied when he told everyone he'd be in Germany for the next 4 months. It's really stupid how people lie for no reason. Okay. So those different parts of the story, and they're each doing something a little bit different. And you might not have put them into exactly this order. You might have a little bit of difference, but probably something very similar to this. Because what we see here is what William Labov, a linguist, called the model of natural narrative. There's kind of a 6-part structure. Maybe you can quibble a little bit on how many parts there are, But a 6-part structure, we start with like an abstract, which is just a signal that we're starting a story. Maybe it includes a bit of a summary, but it just says, okay, we're starting a story now. Then we have an orientation. We give the listener a little bit of background. Where is the story taking place? What happened prior to the start? Then you have the complication. So that's like the events of the story. That's why we're listening. This is the thing that we want to know. Then the resolution. So this is the key event, the thing where maybe this is the climax, sort of where the story turns. And then the evaluation, what it all means. Why am I telling you the story? Why should you care about the story in the first place? And then finally, a coda, right? Some kind of signal that the story is over. It's kind of the inverse of the abstract. It's a conclusion, also maybe a summary, but a signal that the story is over. Okay, now this works really well for presenting a research paper, right? Because in the abstract, you introduce your listener to your topic, you introduce who you are, why you and others are interested in your topic, why the audience should be listening. Your goal there is to hook the audience, make them interested in what you're about to say. Then orientation, you give some background information. What does the scholarly community know about your topic? What do you want the audience to know about your topic? Then your complication, you highlight a gap in the research. Show what's missing from the research, why it's important to fill that gap. This is where you present your research questions. Then resolution, you explain what you did. What's your method? How did you fill that gap? Highlight your key findings. Then your evaluation, explain what your findings mean in the context of the previous research that you referred to. And then your coda, recapitulate, summarize, close the presentation. Just like that, 6-step natural narrative. Tell the story of your research. Okay, so again, back to my thesis. What we want to do is make your presentation more like a conversation than a chapter from a textbook. And one of the ways we do that is by telling the story of your research, because we tell stories in conversations all the time. So if we want to make your presentation more like conversation, tell stories, okay? So that's the first thing. The second thing, though, is we want to make sure we keep it conversational. What does that mean? What does it mean to keep it conversational? How do we make sure our presentation flows like a conversation, feels like a conversation? Well, number one, keep it simple. Don't overload the audience. You can't be throwing tons of information at the audience at once. Maybe your method is really complicated. Maybe there's a lot of stuff that the audience needs to know to really understand what you did and why. But you got to keep it simple. Functionally, what the reason for this is because your audience's memory capacity is limited. We just cannot manage a large amount of information in our working memory at one time. So we got to kind of limit it to maybe 3 to 5 things at once. Fewer is better. 3 to 5 things at once, but then summarize and consolidate. So present, 2 or 3 new things, but then summarize, consolidate, make them into one thing. So you kind of keep like a chunk of the 2 things or 3 things together in your brain at once, so they don't really take up the same proportion of the capacity of your working memory. Okay, and then pause as you're speaking. Build in little breaks to your presentation so that the audience has time to process what you've said. So don't overload, right? Present things in small amounts, consolidate and summarize as you go, and then give your audience time to process what you said. And as you're doing this, you always want to be circling back to key ideas, because conversations are very circular. We come back to the same ideas over and over again. We say the same things over and over again. I've been saying the same things over and over again. So my thesis here, right, is that your presentation should be like a conversation. So I keep saying that. I keep finding new excuses to say that. So we want to come back to that thesis again and again as you move through the presentation. And as you introduce new information, remember in like chunks of like 2 to 3 things at a time, you always want to come back and connect it back to the main idea, right? So always come back to that thesis and connect the new information to the thesis, so that listeners aren't stranded trying to hold a bunch of information in their memory at once and they just forget things. They just lose it. Okay. And now another thing you want to do to prevent your audience from kind of tuning out is to make your presentation interactive. Give your audience nonverbal ways to interact with you. Okay. Ask for shows of hands. Right? How many people think da da da? Or raise your hand if you think A or B. Okay? Use Zoom polls if you're participating through Zoom, if you're doing this through Zoom. Ask rhetorical questions and then maybe list up some answers and ask people, do you agree with this? Do you agree with this? Talk to people in the room, like talk directly to them. Make eye contact so you can see how the audience is responding. And then you can adjust what you're saying based on their response. This one is a little bit more linguistic-y, but use involved language. And this means like pronouns like I and you. Talk about what you did. Use I, right? You are a real person who was involved in this. Your audience are real people who are sitting right there. Talk to them, I and you. Don't say X is interesting, like my topic is interesting because. Just say I was interested in learning about my topic because da, 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 da. Don't say 200 participants were given the survey with that passive voice, were given. Rather just say we gave the survey to 200 participants. This, when we leave out those I's and U's, creates a very sterile sort of text, doesn't feel very involved. But when we are talking directly about what we did and what the audience thinks or why it's important for the audience, it creates a much greater sense of involvement. It brings the audience in and prevents them from losing track of what you're doing or losing interest. And as you're doing this, you want to make sure that you're using your slides to support your oral presentation, right? So the information that goes onto your slides needs to support what you're saying rather than the opposite. You're not just putting all the information up on the slides and reading it out loud. The audience came to hear you talk, not to read your slides. They don't want to hear you read the slides. Use the slides to support your oral presentation rather than using your oral presentation to augment the slides. Okay, so summarizing here. Effective academic presentations, again, much like conversations. They communicate complex ideas in very conversational, involved language. They hit the main ideas repeatedly. They keep things simple. Right. Okay, back to the main thesis here. Make your presentation more like a conversation than a chapter from a textbook. Tell the story of your research, keep it conversational, but there's something we can't forget. Your audience came to your presentation for a reason. They came there to learn, right? Your audience came there to learn, okay? So we want to make sure that you meet your audience's expectations. You meet their goals, okay? So that's the last thing I want to talk about here. You want to meet your audience expectations. They came there to learn something, so help them learn. How do we do that? Well, the number one thing is be precise, okay? Speak precisely. Favor very precise words over vague ones where possible. And this is somewhere where you can use your slides, right? You have some terminology, some very specified terminology, put it up there on the slides and define it so that the people in the audience know exactly what you're talking about. And you can refer back to that over and over again. Again, define these important terms in the slides themselves. Don't overstate your case. Don't be hyperbolic. Just be very careful and clear about what your research adds to the picture of what we know about your topic. And then a really important thing, present your work to be reproducible, okay? People want to come to your presentation, learn about it, and then build on it. So provide references, explain, what the background is. Make the slides comprehensible without the spoken portion of the presentation so that the people who come to your presentation and see you present can then take those slides home and review them and get all of the key information out of them. That doesn't mean that your slides are just, again, everything that you say in the presentation. It's not the case, but the key information should be there so that the things, especially those, the very precise information that you were talking about before, all that is on the slide so that the people who are in the audience can get it later, okay? So include all the key information right there in the slides. Now, you can include extra information as well. But what you want to do in that case is probably move that extra information to the end of the presentation, like after your final slide, after your conclusion slide, or maybe to a handout, and then refer to those extra slides in questions, right? So if someone asks a question about something, you can go to the end and you could stick a slide up there that was ready specifically for that question or for that kind of question. Okay, so conclusion, once again, back to the thesis. So the purpose of an academic presentation is to communicate complex information orally, right? In a face-to-face setup situation, okay? And that's difficult because we are used to, when we need to communicate information, complex information, we're used to writing it down because writing is just very suited for that purpose. But that's not how an academic presentation works, right? We're speaking. So to make it easier to communicate complex information when you're speaking, we want to make an academic presentation more like other spoken face-to-face interactions, less like a written academic text. Okay, and we do this by telling a story of your research, keeping that story conversational, but then also making sure that you give the audience what they came for, which is to learn about your topic. Okay, That's all I got to tell you. Best of luck. I hope the presentations go amazingly well. I'm sure they will. Why wouldn't they? I've got some slides for you, or sorry, some sources for you. Feel free to pause and look these up if you need to. Best of luck.